Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Rapid Response in Missing and Abducted Children Cases. My name is Adam Ash, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide some brief housekeeping announcement. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file, and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a moment to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks at OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can find additional webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Melissa Blazing.
Thank you, Adam, for that introduction. As Adam mentioned, my name is Melissa Blazing, and I am the Region 2 Liaison with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The Amber Alert TTA program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert webinar series. In conjunction with our mission, this series works to bring together state, local, and tribal subject matter experts to present and discuss critical issues related to missing, abducted, and exploited children. To learn more about the Amber Alert program, our training and technical assistance opportunities, and to view past webinars, please visit us at www.ncjtc.org/AmberAlert. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to submit your questions via the Q&A box located on your screen, as we will answer these questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce and turn today's presentation, Rapid Response in Missing and Abducted Children Cases, over to our presenter and subject matter expert, Derek Van Luschen. Derek?
Hey, thanks, Melissa, for the introduction, and welcome, everybody. I'm glad you all could join this afternoon or morning if you're on the West Coast. Just one little disclaimer before I get started. We had a pretty powerful thunderstorm roll through here yesterday, and it knocked down part of a tree right outside of my office. So if you hear some saws and chippers and stuff, it's on my end. But they've kind of quieted down, so I'm hoping that won't be an issue. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer up front. Just to give you a little bit of background on me and a little bit about my bio. I'm a consultant right now with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program, where I'm assigned to a lot of different programs to do with Amber Alert training. So we go around the country and teach about, how to respond, how should communities respond to missing and abducted children. In addition to being a consultant for Fox Valley Technical College, I was also a former law enforcement officer. I started my law enforcement career in 1990 up in northern Montana on a little police department. And then in 1998, I went to the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, where I was an agent there for just about 11 years. And then I got out to not only do consulting with Amber Alert, but also to run our nonprofit, which is called Ryan United. Ryan United was formed in memory of my little brother Ryan, who was 8 years old when he was taken out of our backyard by a repeat sex offender in the community of Libby, Montana. My brother had gone out to play one day at 10:30 in the morning and disappeared, and we looked for Ryan for about a day and a half. Before they found Ryan, The offender that was responsible for his abduction and murder was arrested because they knew that he was in the community. They knew that he had just been released. And so they went and found him and questioned him, and of course they found evidence that led them, that linked him to my brother's disappearance and that led them to my brother's body. So not only professionally is this very important to me that people have response plans and that things are done right in the beginning, but it's also very personal. And the individual that was caught is currently spending 2 consecutive 100-year terms without the possibility of parole. So he won't get out, but we continue to remember Ryan every day and also try and make a difference with everybody out there, not just law enforcement, but communities, because it's a community effort to keep our kids safe and to protect our communities. So with that, I also do a couple other things. I'm a consultant with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where I respond to missing and abducted children cases that law enforcement requests the National Center to get involved in. That's part of a group called Team Adam. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation and what their function is. So that's enough about me. So I'd like to get started with the presentation and just talk a little bit. Kind of how we'll go through this is we'll talk about that initial response to missing and abducted children. You know, what are we looking at as far as a law enforcement response? But then we'll also get into sort of the overall community response. What are we looking for from our community and what's needed to respond as a community to one of these cases? Just to give you a little bit about scope and scale of missing children, what are we looking at approximately each year? How many children go missing in the United States each year? Looks like a really huge number. About 800,000 children go missing each year in this country. Luckily, most of them are found, but there's a few and some statistics I'll talk to you about, you know, that covers the very rare child abduction like my brother faced in 1987. But some of these kids are subject to family abductions where obviously they're taken by a family member. One of the things that I'm starting to tell people with family abductions, especially law enforcement, is to respond to them very seriously. Because we're starting to see a trend with these cases with increased violence towards the children. In fact, we're seeing cases that, you know, the sole reason why the parent takes the child is not to, you know, for the protection of the child or anything. It's revenge against the other parent. So we're seeing those cases really become more violent and more dangerous towards the children. A couple assumptions not to make in child abduction cases is that assume because, you know, the child is missing and making the assumption that that child's just with the other parent. And also making the assumption that because that child's with the other parent that they're safe. Again, we're seeing a trend or an uptick in the violence against children in these cases. The non-family abduction, this is an abduction that occurs when a child is taken by somebody that they're familiar with. So it's not a member of the family, but it's usually somebody that the child is familiar with. So it's a family friend or something like that. Also, within that non-family abduction category, you also have a stereotypical abduction where the child does not know the perpetrator. So like my brother Ryan's case fits right into that category. We don't have many of those, about 60 to 100 cases per year happening in the United States that are that stereotypical kidnapping where that child does not know the perpetrator or the suspect. So those are very rare cases. In fact, they make up less than 1% of missing children cases that we have. However, we need to take those cases seriously. We need to have the resources that we need to respond to those cases before we get one. Not every missing child is going to be that worst case scenario, but we have to plan and we have to have the resources at the ready in case we do encounter that worst case scenario. I always use the analogy when I'm teaching law enforcement that, we all have to go out and qualify every 3 months with our weapon. Why do we do that? Well, we might be in the, faced with a situation where we could have to use deadly force. Same thing here. I mean, you may never pull your gun in your law enforcement career, but you're ready. And that's the same thing when it comes to these rare cases of stranger abductions. We've got to prepare ourselves for that worst case scenario. So I'll talk about some resources that we can use to get ourselves prepared for that. In the last category, runaway or throwaway children. So these are kids that run away from home. So there's a difference between a runaway and a throwaway. So a runaway is a child that wants to be gone. They take off, they get home and they take off and they don't want to be there. Whereas a throwaway child is somebody that, or a child that basically is told by the parents, don't come home, we don't want you here. They don't have a home. So that category is fairly large as far as missing children go. But we've got to keep in mind with runaways, especially as investigators or officers that are responding to these types of cases, that sometimes it's important to find out why this child is running away. Are they running from something and not to something? A case early on in my law enforcement career, I can remember a kid that ran away all the time, and we used to bring him back to his house. He'd run away again, and we'd bring him back. Years later, I found out by talking to him that I asked him, I said, why were you always running away? And he said, from the time I was 9 to the time I was 11 or 12, my stepdad was sexually molesting me. So he was running from that situation. So in those cases, I would remind you to, just to do those interviews and to find out what that situation is. Initial response to missing or abducted children, what we do in the beginning of these cases, it directly impacts how the case will go and the success of finding that child. Mistakes that are made early on really contribute to how the case outcome will be. If we make mistakes early on in the case, I tend to call it a snowball effect, and it's really hard for us to go back and correct those things. So our initial response is very important. Time is definitely our enemy in these cases. I'll show you some statistics here coming up from the Washington State study that was done on children who were abducted and murdered, the worst case scenario. We found from that study that there's very little time for us to respond and have those resources ready to go. So we'll talk about that in a minute. If you're less prepared, it's going to be an ineffective response. So we've got to prepare ourselves not only as law enforcement but as communities to anticipate one of these cases and be ready to respond. This is the Washington State study. This was conducted by the Washington State Attorney General's Office and the U.S. Department of Justice. In 93 to 97, they looked at 577 cases of child abduction and murder cases. So these are cases where it was the worst case scenario. The child was abducted and subsequently murdered. So this is where my family's case fits in. This is where the cases that they looked at. The reason that they looked at these cases was to glean information and resources that were important that law enforcement needed to know to effectively respond to one of these cases. They looked at all the similarities, and they picked out of there some things that responders need to know about effectively managing and responding to one of these cases. And then in 2006, they looked at 175 more cases. So there was an update to the study in 2006, and they really found that the numbers hadn't changed much. The one number that did change was the age of the victim, and I think it went down by 0.5 years. So the victim was 0.5 years younger in the majority of the cases that they looked at in 2006. There is also a study, another update that was done in 2013, and we do not have the numbers to that yet. They're still working through that, so hopefully when they get those, we can share those with you as well. But here's some of the things that they found out. 46.8 of these kids that were abducted and murdered were dead within 1 hour. So within 1 hour after their abduction, they were dead. This is where my brother's case fits in. He was dead, we know, in less than an hour after he was taken. This is a really important stat. The next one, 76.2% of these kids were dead within 3 hours after they were abducted. That's a lot of kids that fit into that category in that time period. So it's really important that we ask ourselves, can we get all of our resources ready to go within that 3-hour time limit? We already have things working against us. If my child went missing, the first thing I would do is obviously start to look. So that eats into our time when it comes to these cases. And then half of these cases that were looked at, 53% of them were not called in for 2 hours. So we have that time against us. So it's important that we have that ready response and we can stand things up quickly. 88.5% of these kids were dead within 24 hours, and 40% were dead before they were even reported missing. Response, quick, organized response is vital. These cases are very fast-moving. I responded at the beginning of March to a case in eastern Montana on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, where a 4-year-old girl was abducted right out of the park. When I got there, I was deployed as part of Team Adam. When I got there, things were crazy. Everybody was running in every direction, obviously looking. Their intention was good, but there was no organization to that search, and no vital information coming back to a central point. So we got ready very quickly, and we stood up a command post so we could start to centralize that information. Once we did that, it started to come together. And again, mistakes are often made in that initial response due to several factors, due to the fact that law enforcement may be untrained, or first responders may be untrained, or everybody just doesn't have that organization going right in the beginning. But having a plan before that child goes missing or before you have one of these calls in your community is vital. And I'll talk about a team, a child abduction response team, here in a little bit, and how that can be formed in your community. Law enforcement response, of course, they need to respond immediately. The time between when my brother was reported missing and the first officer to arrive on the scene actually to talk to my mom was 6 hours. So the faster we can get an officer there, the better, to start investigating right away. Verify all the information, get as much information. What is the circumstances around the disappearance? And then perform quick searches, not only around the house, but around the immediate area. I don't know how many cases I was on in my career where we'd have a missing child and we would respond, search and rescue would come out, we'd have air support up, and the child had crawled back into a closet and gone to sleep or something like that. So, making sure that the child still isn't in the house and performing those quick searches. Interviewing witnesses, making sure that we find that last person to see that child alive. Statistically, we can show that if we can find that last person to see the child, chances are much greater that we can solve this case or get resolution to it. And then call for resources. This is going to take a massive effort on everybody's part to start setting things up to search for this child. So you're going to need a lot of investigative resources, and you're going to need a lot of search and canvassing resources. And we'll talk about search and canvass here in a bit. Who else is responsible? And I've said this already, but it's not just law enforcement's job. It's everybody's job when it comes to one of these cases. I've seen communities that absolutely come together and work together, and I've been involved in a couple of successful recoveries that the reason it was successful was the way the community reacted. So making it a community effort is very, very important. And then finding out who the stakeholders are, who's going to be bringing things to the table, resources that you can use to effectively look and recover a child. So who's going to bring those resources, and where can you get them? And that's all part, again, of that pre-planning that should be going on before one of these cases happens. So, and we'll talk about some stakeholders in a bit here. Well, there we go. We're going to talk about them now. Here's the stakeholders: law enforcement, fire, EMS, the school system, anyone. I mean, these are just a few examples. Anyone who can bring the resources to the table. So using that team concept, really to bring people together and to say, listen, we may never have a missing child in our community, and I hope we don't, but here's what we need to start thinking about when we're thinking about missing children in our community. Who is going to be, who's going to bring what to the table? And I can tell you that it comes right down to who's going to provide food and water for searchers, and I'll go back to that Eastern Montana case that I was on not too long ago, that became an issue. We had folks that were out there that had searched all night into the next day and all the next night, and we were having trouble finding water, and food for these folks. So we put a plea out to the community that, hey, we need some resources here at our command post to help our searchers. And before you know it, it looked like a buffet at the Golden Corral. It was set up along one side of our command post, and we had food, we had water, and that was very, very important. So it may be the simple things, but sometimes they're overlooked. When the rubber meets the road on these, again, they're fast-moving, and people need to think about stuff like that. So, make it a team concept. Have that conversation not only in your agencies but within your community before you get one of these cases. Making a plan. So what makes a good team? What makes that team dynamic? Common interests of people. I work with a lot of civic organizations. In fact, I'm just working right now with the Exchange Club here in Montana. They're a statewide civic organization that one of their main duties or main goals or missions is to protect kids and protect communities. So, they came to our organization and said, what can we do to protect kids in our community? One of the things that we're working on is getting them vetted so they can help out with searches. If they have a child that goes missing in their community, they can actually go out. Law enforcement can count on them because they're already vetted. They have the training. They know what to do, and so they're ready to go. So that's just an example of people that might have common interests and goals that want to do something in the community. So you can reach out to them and get that going and get a plan with them. And time. We'll talk about child abduction response teams. We see our best teams that are set up in this country that are they're very, very well put together, but it takes some time to do that and working out the kinks and different personalities and stuff like that. So it's going to take some time to get that team dynamic going, but it's very important that somebody always is working on it. Who should make up the team? Look around you. There's people that are in your community. There's people that are in law enforcement and criminal justice in general that can help form that team, help begin those conversations, and also bring resources to the table. Not only if a child goes missing, can they bring resources, but they can also bring things like training and to the group and things like that, or to the community about issues that are affecting child safety or child protection within that in that community. So just that team concept of having that plan ready to go and talking to people and getting people together before something like this happens. Again, child abduction response teams, we've set up through the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. This is one of the things that we do, is go around the country and set up these child abduction response teams. And basically what that is it's a multidisciplinary group within the community that responds in the case of a child abduction, or in some cases just of a missing child, where we don't know maybe what happened to that child or where that child's at. But this child abduction response team already has the resources at the ready that they need to respond to one of these cases. So to give you an example of what our CART training is, and how we get these teams formed is we bring them in. I think it's a 3.5-day training we bring them in for, and we start from, okay, policies and procedures on missing and abducted children, and then we end with, okay, now you've recovered the child. So in there, we're taking them through the whole process, not only of the administrative end of it, but then actually giving them a scenario of a child abduction and having them work through that, do a tabletop exercise with that. And by the end of the training, we've got them thinking about what their resources are, but also going back to their communities and thinking about resources they may need to get still. So having them work on that, and then what we'll come back and do, what Amber Alert will come back and do is certify that child abduction response team. So we'll go and we'll take them through an actual child abduction scenario, similar to a disaster, scenario or something like that, but it's a missing child in the community, and we'll watch them work through that and watch them use their resources. And then once they complete that process, there'll be a certified child abduction response team. So if you're interested in that, Melissa can maybe mention it at the end, or where you can go to request something like that. But having those resources ahead of time is crucial, and knowing who can bring what to the table. I said that before, having the resources ready before a child goes missing, and examining the resources. It's one thing to say, well, we need a helicopter. Oh yeah, Joe down the street, he has a helicopter. Well, that's good to know, but making sure that Joe's willing to sit at the table and make sure he's willing to use that resource. And also continually going back and saying, okay, we've got resources, we know we have them, but then checking in with those people that have those resources to make sure they're still willing to come to the table and they still have that resource that you need. So it's a moving thing when it comes to resources, and it's fluid. You've always got to be checking, not only can I get the resource, but who has it and when can they bring it. And like I said, it may come down to real simple things like food and water for searchers or something like that seems very simple when we talk about it right now, but when we're in the middle of one of these cases, it may be harder to get. So just keeping in mind some of the resources there. Searchers and canvassers. Just to explain the difference between a searcher and a canvasser, a searcher is going to be somebody that is out there looking for the child, obviously, looking for potential evidence that could be left by the child or even the suspect. But so your searchers are going to be those folks that are doing a line search in a field. So they're going to be going across a field, or they're going to be searching, a waterway or a certain specific area where there might, this child might be. Whereas a canvasser, that's somebody that's going to go door to door and ask people knocking on the door, have you seen this child? Who else lives in your home? Can we look in your yard? Can we look in your outbuildings? Things like that. So those canvassers are really making contact with people and interviewing them. Yeah, and I see Melissa just put up there in the chat for more information about the CART program. She's got the link there that you can go in, take a look at the program, and request it if you want. Also, air support is something that's going to be needed. Just let me back up to searchers and canvassers. It's going to take a lot of people to come together to search for a child, especially if you have a wooded area or a very dense area where you need to search. It's going to take a lot of folks, and it's going to take people that know what they're doing. So making sure that your searchers are people that are trained, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but making sure that they know what they're doing. Air support, we talked about that, making sure that you know where to get air support if needed. I was just about 4 weeks ago, there was a little boy that wandered out of his yard in western Montana here, and so the detective called me, and I was going to deploy over there, and he said, no, I don't think we need you to, but what are we missing? And the one piece that they were missing that we discussed was that air support. And they found the little boy about 10 minutes after they launched, after that chopper was up in the air over the area, they spotted him, and he'd run off with his dog and you know, wouldn't quit chasing his dog, so he got pretty far away. But having that air support is important. Water support, people that are able to you know, search in water. We've got a kid missing right now. He's 19 years old, but he's missing in our community right now. I don't know why he did this, but he tried to ride his motorcycle across the lake, and it went down, and he went with it. So they have people that are out there right now searching for him using very sophisticated equipment. So knowing where to get that water support, not only the boats, but all that equipment. A lot of times you can rely on your local search and rescue. They've got all that searching equipment that you know, entails divers and sonar and different things like that. So having that ahead of time, bringing them to the table, knowing where you can get that. Canine, the use of dogs when we're searching for missing children. There's different kinds of scent discriminating dogs out there. In the case in eastern Montana, we were using Border Patrol dogs. They're man-tracking dogs, and then what it did was we had so many searchers that these dogs were getting confused and actually picking up the scent of some of our searchers. So we brought in different dogs, and actually the National Center flew them right into Wolf Point, Montana, and they were wilderness search dogs, and we also brought in one cadaver dog. And so making sure that you have dogs, but also have the right dogs, you know, making sure they're right for the job. Also, command post, this is one of the most important features of one of these cases, is having that command post set up, having people there that not only know how to run it, but also people there that are gathering the information that's coming in, and they're organizing it for you and for everybody else. Because that's important when we get leads that come in that it go to one centralized location. I've been on a couple of these where there's multiple command posts set up, and the problem with that is the information doesn't flow right, and it doesn't go into one particular area where it can be, you know, looked at, analyzed, and you know, the child recovered as a result of that information coming in. So making sure you get that command post support, making sure you know somebody that knows how to run that. They may have, you know, the ICS training, Incident Command System training, where they know, you know, the authority and the hierarchy of a command post. So getting somebody, you know, that knows that stuff is important beforehand. Who can bring what to the table and when? You know, if it's, you know, like I said, the Saturday at 2 a.m. rule, you know, what can you get on Saturday morning at 2 a.m.? You know, who's able to bring that? Can you call them out? Are they able to bring it right away? You know, different things like that, looking at resources and knowing who can bring them, and also knowing what time you can get them or how quickly you can get them into place is important. And also MOUs and agreements, not only for equipment and things like that, but also manpower. When you have searchers from other agencies that come in, how are they going to be covered? And I'll give you an example. I call it the gopher hole example, because we had one of our searchers that stepped in a large, well, we think it might be a badger hole because his whole leg went into it, but he broke his leg. He was from a different agency, and the question came up later, okay, how is he covered? Was he on duty? Was he off duty? Does the agency where the child was missing, do they cover it? And obviously it didn't get too messy, but you know, there was that question that came up. So that goes to show you the importance of the MOUs and making sure agreements are in place before we have something like this go on. So if we need manpower from a neighboring agency, how are we going to get that? What's their authority going to be when they get there? Those types of things can be worked out in an MOU. So making sure that those are in place. Using resources in the community. Using volunteer searchers. The things I'll say about volunteer searchers, when you have a case like this in your community, you're going to have people that come out in droves that want to help. They want to find the child, and rightly so. I mean, you know, it's not wrong to have that happen. But we need to remember with volunteers that they need to be trained, and also they need to be vetted. There needs to be a way to make sure that they're vetted. And by vetted, I mean making sure that, you don't have all your sex offenders out looking for the child, or also making sure that you don't have your suspect. And the Washington State study, they looked at how many of the offenders actually came back into the investigation or reinserted themselves into the investigation. And they found about 10% of those cases that they looked at, the actual offender came back to try and assist. And usually it was in that search process where they tried to assist in finding the child. So, making sure that our searchers are trained, making sure that somehow we vet them or that we do something to make sure that they should be there. Training is very important for volunteer searchers, because if they do come up on evidence, if they're searching and suddenly they come up on something in a field, how do they handle that? Do they, we don't obviously want them damaging or contaminating the evidence, so making sure that they know once they find something to stop, mark it, and then call in a team that is going to be able to process that item and collect it properly and photograph it and everything like that. So, making sure that they're trained and making sure that they're vetted. Also with searchers, I will say that if you have a lot of searchers that come out and they want to do something, and I'm talking from a law enforcement perspective or a command post perspective, if you've got 100, well, in the Eastern Montana case, we had over 100 people that came out, and they showed up at our command post, and they said, we're ready to search. And at first, the guy that was in charge of the command post, he said, I don't think we want the community searching. But we couldn't just go and tell the community that, no, you're not welcome to help out with this. We knew that we couldn't do that because it was a tight-knit community. Everybody knew this little girl. They wanted to find her. So what we did with those searchers is we said, okay, we understand that you want to help search. If everybody could help us by searching their own backyards and their own outbuildings, things like that anywhere this child could be, go and do that and make sure, if you find anything, you report that back to the command post. So things like that, just giving them a job, because if you don't, community members will start forming their own search teams. We had a Western Montana case where a little boy ended up falling into a septic tank, and it was an accident, but when they were looking for him, the community came out and they wanted to help search, and the sheriff in that case said, no, we don't need you, and please, it's a law enforcement function. We don't want the community's help. What the community did at that time is they went and formed their own search groups. And the problem with that is that we weren't getting the information back that was needed, and the information that was vital to the investigation, or if somebody found something that was part of the investigation, it wasn't coming back. The information was not coming back to our command post. So making sure that your volunteers are given something to do. We also use volunteers in a few different incidents that I've been on. We've used volunteers to go get things like food and water and go to the community and say, listen, the searchers need food or the searchers need water. And you will have people that come out that are very happy to do that end of it and want to help obviously find the child, but also support those folks that are out there working to find this child. And also use of facilities. If you have a missing child in a community, where's your command post going to be set up? Where can you get a building that can house a command post? In the Eastern Montana case, we had their cultural center that they had just built, a beautiful brand new building, and they gave us a conference room for that. But also we needed a facility, because it was cold out, we needed a facility to bring our volunteers into and to debrief our searchers and things like that. So really looking around the community and finding facilities. And again, this sounds pretty, obvious, but when it comes down to it, we need those plans already in place and those agreements with folks that, run these facilities or have facilities that we can use. So looking for those kinds of things in the community is important. Other resources in the community, civic organizations, like I mentioned, going to civic organizations that want to help protect kids and give them a job to do, teaching them how to search, teaching them how to not canvass, but search and have them vetted for that process. Also getting prevention material in the community, having folks that go out and actually talk about prevention. What's going to protect children? What's going to protect them from being abducted? There's a lot of resources through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that can be downloaded for nothing, and you can go out and you can make presentations in your community. Also, and I mentioned the National Center, they've got a lot of resources, but there's also other nonprofits out there that have resources for this. The Polly Klaas Foundation, our organization, Ryan United. There's a lot of organizations out there that work very, very hard every day to make sure that communities have the resources it takes to protect children. So, look at NCMEC, but also there's a lot of other nonprofits out there that do prevention type things. Also, citizens academies, those are great. Those are great areas to find folks that are really wanting to help out. Again, those folks that take the Citizens Academy, they've already been vetted. They've already, passed a background check, and they'll get the training because that's part of their training. So, if your community has a Citizens Academy that they, the police department or sheriff's department puts them through, that's a pretty good area to get resources because, again, they'll volunteer and usually they're trained. So whose job is it? Bottom line, it's everybody's job to protect children in the community. So it's a united effort, and it's something that you've got to have that plan up front, and you've got to have those resources up front. And when I do community presentations, I always tell them, you may never get one of these cases in your community, but you have to be prepared, and you have to take, all the training that you get, all the resources that you have very, very seriously, and continue to not only look for resources, but also to continually go back, look at, what needs replenished. And also with any team or child abduction response team you may start, there is, you have to make sure that you don't lose people. A lot of times we see, especially with law enforcement, when we start these child abduction response teams, we see members of law enforcement that are part of the team that retire, or they take a promotion, or they go somewhere else in the department, and that they lose touch with the child abduction response team, and sometimes that's not backfilled by the agency. So ensuring that there's constant updates, that people are always refreshed, that new people that come in are trained, and new people that come in sort of know the mission and what it is that the team's supposed to do. But making sure that those teams are constantly updated. I think I'll hand it back over to Melissa. Is that right, or do we take questions and answers now?
Yep, so I have a few questions for you that I was hoping you could expand upon.
Okay.
And so the first one is do you have, or could you provide a few recommendations on how the community can support the family during the initial report of the missing child, and then even expand upon that in cases where it's long-term missing cases?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as supporting the family, that's very, very important. I go back to, I was 17 when my brother was taken. I remember very, very clearly that there weren't a lot of folks that could help us through or to understand the system, to understand the justice system. Our family was sort of thrown into that. But there are, in lots of communities, there's victim advocates that can deal with the family, and not only deal with the family, but be a liaison between law enforcement and that family who's going through that situation. As far as community members coming in to help the family, there's lots of support that they can give, whether it's just food for the family, things that will help keep the family as comfortable as possible, different things like that that can come, community members can come in and play a part of that. And back to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they have a whole team of folks, and the program is called Project Hope. And what Project Hope is these are parents. My mom is a Project Hope volunteer. These are parents and siblings that have been through a missing child. They've had a sibling or they've had a child that went missing. So if you have that and you're dealing with that family, if you call 1-800-THE-LOST and you request Project Hope, they'll come out and they'll be with that family. And it's usually somebody they'll choose that has been through a very similar situation. So that really, I've seen it work, and it's really a comfort to the family. So that's the resource through the National Center.
Thanks, Derek. So I'd just like to remind our listeners to continue to submit questions in the Q&A box as we continue this portion. And so, Derek, our next question is, are there missing person scenarios available so police departments can run in-house tabletop trainings? And so I know that we, through the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program, do have some tabletop exercises that we do. So if you could expand upon that and any other resources, that would be great.
Yeah, those are excellent trainings to do, because I think it really blends not only training, but it also blends, a practical exercise where you're thinking in terms of boots on the ground and resources that you need to go through that. So when we come in and do a tabletop exercise with your agency, it's a scenario based on an actual case that we've reviewed. So it's a real situation. We haven't made it up out of, off the top of our head. It's a real situation that's happened. So we'll take that and we'll divide people up into groups and we'll start the scenario. And we take it in stages. So, for example, one of them that I do, the little girl left for school. She started walking home and she never made it home. So that's the first part of the information we give you. And so we go, okay, your agency gets a call like this. What's the initial steps that you take? She was last seen at the school, walking home. Her home's less than 5 minutes away. She never returned. And then the next slide we give you, it'll be, okay, now her shoes found at an intersection that's close to the school and close to her home. What would your agency do? So we break it down like that, and really what it helps do is just help you determine at each stage, okay, what would we do? How would we respond? And what resources would we need to do it properly? I know that there are tabletop exercises available, and I don't think they're online at this time, but again, if you reach out to Melissa, too, she can help you, guide you if your department wants that, a tabletop exercise. But I was just asked this question 2 weeks ago when I was out in New Mexico. They said, how do we set up a scenario not only for our agency but our community? And I said, it's as simple as pointing to a house down the street and say, there's a 5-year-old girl that just went missing out of that front yard, and that's all you know. And then starting there and expanding from there and figuring out, okay, what will we do as an agency? What will we do as a community? And what resources do we need to respond to that little missing girl down there? So that's a little bit about tabletop exercises.
Thanks, Derek. Our next question is, are there any resources or trainings for working with youth, runaway, throwaway population where missing persons report is filed? And I would direct folks to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and I know that they are working very hard in this area. Derek, do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, there are, of course, the National Center is very involved with, with runaways, throwaways, but then also tied in with that now we have not only runaway and throwaway to be worried about, but a lot of these children who do run away or that are thrown away are becoming victims of child sex trafficking or human trafficking. There's lots of different agencies out there, lots of different nonprofits out there that work on that issue, and it ties in with runaways and throwaways. So the National Center is one group, but I know that there's several nonprofits out there that do deal with runaways and throwaways. The Polyclass Foundation, deals in that a little bit too. So those are, there's lots of resources out there, but I would guide you to the National Center. And also we have, for law enforcement training on this issue, we have two consultants out of Dallas, Texas, Byron Fassett and Kathy De La Paz, who are very, they work it every day, and the presentation they give is fascinating. So from a law enforcement resource perspective, to have them come into the community and give that presentation would be a great resource. And I know that they're available again through Fox Valley Technical College.
Thanks, Derek. So our next question is how do we engage law enforcement when it appears to be a custody issue, but we know that, and kind of connecting to the issues surrounding family abductions. So I think kind of the question is what's the proper way to handle a report when the assumption is a custody issue and the potential of it becoming a family abduction?
And that is, it's something that, and I'll tell you, in my law enforcement career, I responded to a few of these where you would respond and you would say, well, geez, this is a custody issue. It's a civil thing. It's something, that we can't get involved with as law enforcement. But I think through our training that we do through the Amber Alert program, I teach the family abduction portion of that. We're trying to get law enforcement to look outside the box and other things that they can do. Instead of just saying it's a custody situation and not handling it. The most important thing I think that needs to happen is that the prosecutor needs to be on board right away when one of these cases occurs, because it's difficult for law enforcement at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, and all of a sudden they've got a custody situation that may be a family abduction, and they're having to figure out custody orders, and they're having to figure out visitation stuff, and it gets very, very difficult for law enforcement to make that call. So we encourage law enforcement to try and have their prosecutors on board, and then try and look for other things. Is there other things that are happening? Is there child endangerment that's involved? Is there other issues that, possibly the taking parent could be charged for? So thinking in terms of other things that could apply in the situation, but I agree with the person that's asking the question. It's something that it's difficult for law enforcement to deal with, but again, they've got to think outside the box and be thinking of other things and other resources that they can use to recover that child, because these family abductions are very dangerous.
Thanks, Derek. And I just kind of wanted to expand a little bit about the different training courses that we provide. We do offer, as Derek mentioned, some different CART training programs. We offer some advanced investigative strategies for missing and abducted children. We have online courses as it relates to this issue, both from telecommunication best practices for missing and abducted children. And once again, we do provide an online training for CART, the new members, as well as child sex trafficking and the law enforcement response. So I do encourage folks to visit our website for some additional information in regards to what types of trainings are out there. And if we don't necessarily have the answer for you, folks like myself are happy to help you and point you in the right direction. And I see that we have another question. And so, Derek, do you have any examples of youth organizations or groups that have spoken with other youth on more of the prevention side of exploitation?
As far as the prevention side, again, I think the National Center does a really good job of putting materials out, not only for schools, but also teachers. I just, at the end of the school year, I did a presentation for the teachers for our school district locally, And their concern was, children being exploited online. So making sure that, you check out their resources, and they have a lot of stuff that can be downloaded on, child exploitation online, that sort of prevention. They have things that can be downloaded on, sexual abuse prevention. There's a lot of different organizations out there that have that material. Also, if you go to the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Managing Apprehension, Registering and Tracking, it's an acronym, it's the SMART office, and I always mess it up, but they have a bunch of resources there that you can go to their website. I think it's just smart.gov. I'm trying to bring it up here, but going to their website and, smart.gov, and they have a whole bunch of resources under that in their website about prevention. And it is if you'll go to their page, you can get different tools, different resources that are out there for sexual abuse prevention for children. All those different things are there. So, that's another resource. And I know that there's a lot of, private nonprofit organizations that do the prevention stuff as well. So, Google's a great thing. Get in there and Google some things, but, making sure that you get a program that's going to be good, and that they've had, a lot of experience in that, and they've got good information that's been vetted, and because you don't want to get some off-the-wall organization and pretty soon you've given the wrong message. So I would start at the National Center, look at SMART, the SMART website as well, and there's just a lot of stuff out there for that.
Thanks, Derek. And so we did have a last question, but I'm going to wait, okay. And because the question is actually in reference to a topic that we'll be discussing in a few weeks. So I know we had a question about, does law enforcement refer to sex offender registries when a child is missing? And so I just wanted to let our audience know that in a few weeks we'll be having another webinar with Derek, and it will be on sex offenders and child abductions. So we will look to answer that question during that session. And so I also encourage everybody to register for that event. The information will be sent out in the upcoming week. And so I just wanted to also thank you, Derek, for providing your insight and responding to our audience's question and presenting this webinar.
Yeah, it was great, and I hope everybody got a lot out of it.
Thank you. And like I mentioned before, please stay tuned for future webinar announcements from our Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Center, and the webinar that Derek will be providing will be sent out in the upcoming week. Adam, I'll turn the presentation back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for today's presentation, and Derek, thank you for a great presentation. I just wanted to remind everyone to please take 5 minutes to complete the online evaluation survey. And remind everyone again that we are archiving this webinar, and it should be available in about 3 weeks on our online university. Should you have additional questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to either OJJDP, NTTAC, or Fox Valley. And again, here on your screen is the evaluation link, and we thank you for joining us again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.